The Infinity Blade games were a masterpiece. They defined an era and proved that mobile games truly could compete with consoles. They had a fascinating development, a cherished touch-based combat system, and some of the richest lore and storylines in all of gaming. And yet all three games mysteriously disappeared from the App Store on December 10th, 2018. With only a vague answer as to why from the game's creators, fans were left wondering what really happened to these games. The story of Infinity Blade's development is quite fascinating. It was developed by Chair Entertainment and Epic Games. Yes, that Epic Games, the one known today for the Unreal Engine and Fortnite. In fact, Infinity Blade was the first ever mobile game to take advantage of Unreal Engine 3. And if you were around for the golden era of the App Store, you know this game towered above the rest in terms of scope and graphics. Infinity Blade released on April 9th, 2010. Just to give you some perspective, the other big app games that released that year were Angry Birds, Cut the Rope, and Fruit Ninja. All great games, but they really paled in comparison to Infinity Blade's 3D graphics, amazing exploration, and touch-based combat. What's even more mind-blowing is that Infinity Blade was developed by only 12 people in just 5 months. Most big-budget games today take anywhere from 2 years to 6 years to develop, or 11 years if you're Ubisoft working on Skull and Bones. The point is, this is a ludicrous amount of time to develop a game. And not only did they pull it off, but they created perhaps the best game in App Store history. So who was the mastermind behind the idea for the game, and the leader of the creative team? Well, after doing a bit of research, the answer is none other than Donald Mustard. This name might sound familiar to you. Not only did Donald Mustard direct the Infinity Blade series, but he went on to co-create one of the most successful video games of all time, Fortnite. I could not believe this while I was doing the research for this video. Even though Infinity Blade and Fortnite could not be more different, Donald Mustard was the creator of both of them. I knew that the Infinity Blade had been put into Fortnite as an item for a limited time, but I had always assumed that this was just because both games were owned by Epic, and it was a fun little Easter egg. But it turns out it was much more than that. At the time that Infinity Blade released, it was the fastest grossing app in iOS history. It made $1.6 million in just the first 4 days after its release, and over $23 million by the end of 2011. This game took the world by storm. Critics praised it for its incredible graphics and its touch-based fighting system. It allowed you to swipe your finger across the screen in any direction, and your character would match your movements with his sword swipes. A single playthrough of the game was known as a bloodline. During this, you'd play as Cyrus, and go through waves of enemies as you try to explore through the castle and make your way to King Radriar. The king was a very powerful enemy, so it was most likely that you'd be defeated multiple times before eventually defeating him. After each defeat, the bloodline would restart, and you'd begin at the beginning of the castle. But you'd keep with you all of your level experience, weapons, shields, and other items. The developers wanted players to be able to pick up and play the game for just a few minutes, which would be the equivalent of a single battle, or for a half-an-hour session, which would be the equivalent of a full bloodline. This pacing was implemented to create intentional breakpoints in the gameplay. The game would go on to receive 4 free expansions that added weapons, game modes, and new endings. It had very addictive gameplay, where you were incentivized to perfectly time your dodges and blocks to avoid getting hit by enemy attacks. Shields had a limited amount of hits they could take in a single battle, and dodges had to be performed in the correct direction to move out of the way of the enemy's attack. This created a fun system where you could get better and better at the game by learning the different attack patterns of each enemy type. There were slow and heavy enemies with very telegraphed attacks that would land crazy damage on you if they could manage to get a hit, while faster and nimble enemies were much more difficult to anticipate. After each battle, you'd gain experience points, which would allow you to level up and master your weapons, shields, and armor. The points you gain from leveling up could be allocated to one of 4 different stats: health, attack, defense, or magic. The customization in this game was amazing. Along with stats, you could buy or sell things like helmets, armor, weapons, shields, and magic rings. Creating your unique character build was one of the funnest parts of this game. And looking back on it now, this series reminds me a lot of Dark Souls. Everything from the character builds to the strategic combat and the aesthetics. It's very possible that these developers took inspiration from Demon Souls, because Dark Souls released only 1 year after Infinity Blade. Once you got better at the game, you could try more advanced techniques like parrying enemies' attacks by swiping in the same direction that their attack was coming in from. This would often leave them staggered so that you could get in some major damage. And you were always looking for the opportune time to pull out either your special attack or your magic. By drawing a certain shape with your finger, you could either attack the enemy with an elemental effect or heal yourself. Strategically, you could save your super attack for when your enemy was about to use one of their most devastating attacks and interrupt them. Even though the game loop of Infinity Blade was pretty simple, there was so much depth to the gameplay. And there was always new ways to both improve your in-game character and your skills as a player. Another one of my favorite things about the game was during cutscenes when you were walking from one location to another, you could actually move the camera by swiping on the screen and click on little bags of gold. Being able to collect loot during cutscenes was very unique, and I honestly haven't seen it in any other game since. And because the location of loot would change on each bloodline, it would give you something to look out for even with cutscenes you had already seen many times. Another fun aspect of the game was that helmets, armor, and weapons came with different perks. For example, maybe a sword does less damage than some of the other swords that you could buy, but it came with the ability to deal slow poison damage over time after each successful hit. There were many different elemental effects like this, such as lightning, fire, and ice. But there were also other perks that you could go for, like bonus experience points or increased chance of finding gold. If you play these games, I'm sure you noticed how beautiful and realistic the animations look. This is because Cherry used motion capture to capture the performances of real actors doing these moves. And it really went a long way to sell all the different motions in the game, like running, fighting, and climbing. Another great thing about the game is it offered multiple branching paths when it came to exploration. While these would all loop back to King Radriar in the first game, the sequels would take this idea much farther. But still, the amount of player choice offered in the first game alone was unbelievable at the time. Each enemy type you fought had their own combat style, and while some would become easy to deal with after repeated encounters, others would offer plenty of challenge to the player with some truly devastating mix-ups and attacks. This variety made Infinity Blade a great game for players of all different skill levels, and the fact that you could get it on an iPhone or an iPad made it super accessible to a gigantic number of players. The story of Infinity Blade 1 is pretty straightforward. Cyrus is on a mission to defeat the tyrant King Radriar, who rules over the people of Lantamore. Radriar is an oppressive king who's known as a Deathless. He thinks of himself as a god, and he wields the only blade known to be able to defeat a Deathless, the Infinity Blade. When Cyrus is defeated at the hands of Radriar, it appears that we're playing as the descendant of Cyrus, Cyrus' son who swears to avenge his father. We later learn in the second game that Cyrus is actually a Deathless himself, and rather than his descendants avenging him, he's actually been reborn time and time again. 2 books were written by best-selling fantasy author Brandon Sanderson. Yes, that Brandon Sanderson, the one who wrote the Way of Kings series and one of my favorite books of all time, Elantris. Infinity Blade Awakening was published on October 4th, 2011. It detailed the events that took place between the first and second game. 2 years later, Infinity Blade Redemption was published on September 8th, 2013. It detailed the events following the second game and set up the story for the third, which had not yet released. But getting back to the ending of Infinity Blade 1, once you finally defeat all of the enemies and monsters in your path, you finally make your way up the elevator to the throne room of the king. The only thing that stands between you and him is his Dark Knight bodyguard, who you will have to defeat if you want to reach Radriar. This fight can be pretty tough. He has a really strong shield bash attack, as well as some unexpected kicks that he'll throw in every once in a while that you're not able to parry. But all in all, this fight is really not too bad, especially compared to your fight with Radriar. While the Dark Knight's attacks are mostly slow and predictable, the King's are much faster and harder to anticipate. He congratulates you for defeating all of his champions, but warns you that this fight will be the true test. For anyone who played this game as a kid, they'll remember the countless times they got decimated by this final boss. The King does not go easy on you, and if your dodge and block timing are not perfect, you'll have no chance of defeating him. But if you're able to push through and get some hits on him, about a fourth of the way through his health bar, a new option will be presented to you. He'll tell you that out of all the challengers who have faced him, you are the first one to prove worthy. You have the choice to join him or to take up your sword and continue the fight. If you choose to join Radriar, you'll bow down before him. Radriar will be very pleased, and he'll explain that at one point he was also immortal, and that even now there's deathless out there that are more powerful than he is, ones that have achieved extreme power and become corrupt. He promises that with your forces joined together, the two of you will go out and vanquish all the rest of the deathless. It's pretty cool that there's just a straight up evil ending, where you become the villain you swore to destroy. But if you take up your sword, the battle will rage on. Like I said before, the King is not easy to defeat. Once you get him down to his last bit of health, he'll knock you back from the throne. At this point, your shield's probably broken and you're getting wrecked, but if you can hang on just long enough to get in the finishing blow, you'll be treated to one of the best cutscenes in the game. Cyrus throws down his sword and his shield and grabs the Infinity Blade, redirecting it and stabbing it through Radriar. He can't believe what you've done, and swears that from now on, the Deathless will be hunting you down. The last thing Cyrus does is rips the Infinity Blade from Radriar's corpse, keeping it for himself. But if you stick around to the end of the credits, you'll see that the game is hiding one last secret. Cyrus approaches the throne and sees that there's a small control panel on the side of it. This is obviously an Easter egg that's supposed to look like an iPhone, but he clicks the button and activates it. Large metal contraptions begin to lower from the ceiling of the castle. When they come down into position, a holographic image of a planet suddenly appears. Cyrus is shocked by this discovery. At the start of Infinity Blade 2, we're introduced to a new character named Issa. She's traveling with Cyrus, and we learn that Cyrus's new goal is to find someone called the Worker of Secrets. He believes that the Worker is powerful enough to help him fight off all the Deathless that will be hunting him down, and that together they can free humanity from the evils that rule their world. He starts this quest at Sadie's palace. She's an information dealer that might know the whereabouts of the Worker, and she's one of the Deathless. Issa warns Cyrus that this is a foolish and dangerous course, but he's committed to it. At this point, the player takes control of Cyrus, and much like the first game, you fight through waves of enemies to get to Sadie. This section serves as the tutorial for the game, but right away you'd be fighting enemies with new fighting styles we hadn't seen before. I also have to say that these beautiful bamboo gardens and Asian palace areas were so stunning. The visuals were already impressive in the first game, but the second took them to a whole new level. And while the first game had a very traditional European medieval look, the second benefited a lot from leaning into some Asian cultural influence. There were also a lot more sci-fi technological type areas that made the game feel unique. After fighting off quite a few enemies in the garden, you would finally make your way up the stairs and encounter Sadie for the first time. Sadie is the first Deathless that we meet outside of Radriar. After seeing Cyrus's impressive fighting skills, she offers to make him a champion and to give him riches, women, and power that come with it. Cyrus rejects this offer, but demands to know where he can find the Worker of Secrets. Sadie becomes angry when he asks this question, but tells him that the Worker of Secrets is in the place called the Vault of Tears that used to be known as Saranthia. She then begins attacking, and we enter into the first boss fight of the game. With her long spear, she can shoot columns of fire that had to be blocked or dodged in the correct direction. She also had many moves that we had never seen before in Infinity Blade 1. She had some cool ones like swinging it behind her back and throwing out some unexpected karate chops that you couldn't parry. Overall, the fight was pretty short and sweet, but it was definitely a memorable one. Cyrus finishes off Sadie with the Infinity Blade. and then walks over to the pedestal that has an Infinity Blade shaped indentation in it. He inserts the blade only to hear a familiar voice behind him. He turns to find King Radriar. Not only is he not dead, but he's tricked Cyrus into giving up the Infinity Blade. Cyrus demands a fight, but Radriar teases him, telling him that he doesn't know what he is, and calling him by a name he's never heard before, Alfsar. Radriar raises the Infinity Blade to strike him down. Right before he's able to do so, Issa snipes Cyrus, hitting him directly in the head. Cyrus falls to the ground, and Issa quickly makes her escape. Cyrus wakes up in some kind of lab. He's been reborn, but this time he retained his memories. This is where the game actually begins, and Cyrus sets out on his mission to free the worker. Infinity Blade 2 was the peak of the series for me. Not only did it have a much more detailed storyline and gorgeous visuals, but it improved upon the first game's gameplay in nearly every aspect. There were now small, medium, and large chests, which required their corresponding key to open. These chests offered great rewards, but it meant that you would either have to find the correct key or buy it yourself. Another one of my favorite additions were the prize wheels. These things basically acted like carnival wheels, where you would spin them and land on a random item. It was basically the equivalent of loot box gambling back in 2011, especially since you could purchase in-game money if you wanted to. Some of the items you could land on the wheel were pretty worthless, but there was always a slim chance that you could find an ultra rare item from a prize wheel that was worth way more than the wheel itself. There was also this one room with a bunch of different doors that could only be opened if you had a specific weapon. It had some really cool treasure locked behind them and gave you a reason to collect a bunch of different types of weapons. It had this mysterious nature to it, and you always wanted to go and return to this room on every bloodline to see if you had found a weapon that fit one of the doors. They added gems that you could equip to weapons. Each gem came with a perk, such as an elemental magic effect or added attack damage. As long as your weapon had a slot that was the same shape as that gem, you could attach the gem to your weapon and get the effects. This added even more depth when it came to creating your own character custom build. But what was even better for that was introduced in Infinity Blade 2 was the new weapon class system. You can now choose between light, medium, and heavyweight weapons to use in battle. Medium weapons function just like Infinity Blade 1, where you held a sword in one hand and a shield in the other. The lightweight weapon class used dual blades to fight. You'd hold a weapon in each hand with no way to defend yourself. Instead, not only were you able to dodge left and right, but you could now duck underneath attacks. Each slash did less damage than the other classes, but it more than made up for it in speed. Back in the day, this was my favorite weapon class. It looked super cool and flashy, and it was the most technical because you couldn't rely on blocks if you didn't know how to deal with one of the enemy's attacks. It made you learn how to dodge every single hit, and to rely much more on parrying. Heavy weapons, on the other hand, act just the way that you would imagine. You would hold a single large weapon with two hands. This meant that blocking was more limited than the medium weapon class, but it definitely made up for it in raw damage. These bulking weapons would hit hard if you could manage to find an opening. It was the slowest of all the weapon classes, but still not too far behind the others. Having different types of weapons like this really went a long way in adding to the variety in the gameplay. It meant you could finally choose your own fighting style, and kept all the bloodlines from feeling too repetitive. Speaking of variety, one of the best things that Infinity Blade 2 added was multiple bosses and multiple endings, depending on which route you took. In order to unlock the Veil of Tears, you would have to defeat all 4 of the game's main bosses. After each one, Cyrus would give up his own life by sticking his hand into one of the seals and unlocking it. This made the game feel a lot more like a choose-your-own-adventure style story than a linear one. You could learn little bits of lore about Cyrus's past as Alfsar, and everything felt like it was culminating towards your ultimate goal of freeing the Worker of Secrets. These boss fights felt very distinct, since each one had their own backstory, and a completely different fighting style from one another. This did a lot to add world building, and to create a sense of mystery around the Worker, and what his true motives were. I'm very nostalgic for these battles, and they really gave the game a sense of progression, which it felt like the first game lacked at certain points because of how repetitive it was. There was always so much excitement in discovering a new boss in this game. It felt like you never knew what was around the corner or how you were going to deal with it. It kept you on your toes, and some of these guys were pretty intimidating. But even if you died, you were so thrilled to get back there and try again. After unlocking all 4 seals, you would return to the entrance to the Vale of Tears. Cyrus would place his arm into the middle seal, but this time instead of killing him, the entire floor would begin to glow. You would ride this elevator deep down into the workers' prison. Upon arrival, you would get your first glimpse at the Worker of Secrets. But soon afterwards, Thane would return and try to stop you from freeing the worker. If you were able to defeat him again, the worker would come up behind him and show you his true power. He was able to kill the Deathless, even without an Infinity Blade, by destabilizing their quantum identity pattern. Cyrus is finally able to meet and talk with the Worker of Secrets. The worker refers to him by his ancient name, Alsar, and reminds him of the promise he made millennia ago to free the worker. Cyrus admits that he doesn't remember much about his past life, and introduces himself now as Cyrus. The worker asks Cyrus what he desires. Cyrus reveals that his goal is to release the worker and to join forces to destroy the rest of the Deathless and free their world from evil. The worker agrees, but explains that he can only go free if Radriar is brought to the prison. He asks Cyrus to do one last thing for him, to defeat Radriar and bring him to the Vale of Tears. Cyrus accepts the challenge and goes out looking for the king. He returns to Sadie's palace and rings the bell, calling out for Radriar. Cyrus waits for some time, but eventually Radriar returns and promises that he'll finally end Alsar for good. Cyrus draws his sword, and the fight begins with dark rain clouds looming overhead. This battle is as intense as it is memorable. It's very reminiscent of the ending of the first game, except Radriar has a lot of new moves and a giant health bar. You really had to combine the knowledge from all the other bosses you defeated in the game to take him down. This time around, he could wield beams of magic to throw at you from afar. But the close-up fights with fast swordplay felt very true to the original game. He also had a lot of sneaky moves this time, like some quick kicks and shield bashes, which were difficult to predict and prepare for. I really loved this fight, and it was the perfect way to finish off the game. Eventually, Cyrus whacks the Infinity Blade from Radriar's hand, disarming him. Radriar curses Alsar, and says that killing him will not end this. Cyrus takes up the Infinity Blade and agrees, knocking him out cold. This ending is so amazing, I think I'll let you listen for yourself.
I defeated Radriar. He can take your place in this eternal prison.
Excellent. It looks like he gave you quite a fight. Quickly, my friend, release me, and together we will reshape this world. Oh, did I forget to mention? For me to leave this prison, another Deathless must take my place. I must thank you, Alsar. Not only have you freed me, but you've eliminated many of my rivals for this world. Those who remain will follow me. Or I will take from them that which they hold most dear, their eternal life. Unfortunately, for me to escape, old friend, I'll have to let you keep your life. You can spend an eternity in this cell. You and Radriar can keep each other company. It's only fair. After all, you were the one who imprisoned me here to begin with.
No. What have I done? No!
This twist ending left me speechless as a kid. Cyrus has been through so much to free the worker, and only now does he realize that he was the one who imprisoned the worker there to begin with, at a time he can no longer remember. And after everything, he's tricked into taking the place of the worker in the eternal prison of the Vale of Tears. This is why Infinity Blade 2 is my favorite game in the series. I have to confess that I never actually played Infinity Blade 3, which is very surprising considering the amount of hours I poured into the first two games. My only theory as to why this could be is because Pokemon X and Y released the same year in 2013. I was pretty obsessed with those games at the time, which may have been why I missed this one. But I have now finally seen a full playthrough of the game. At the start, we learn that Radriar and Cyrus were able to escape the workers' prison. Radriar shows up at the workers' fortress and demands a fight to the death. The worker tells Radriar how much he admires his unique abilities, and how it would be a terrible shame to destroy him. We learn that the Worker of Secrets not only forged the original Infinity Blade, but that he's been creating new ones. Radriar questions this, and the Worker tells him that he had to be sure he could replicate the blade that could kill the Deathless. He suggests that not even the Infinity Blade is powerful enough to destroy him. Radriar asks if he's all-powerful, why did he allow himself to be in prison for 1,000 years? And then he realizes it. It's Alsar. Alsar is the key to destroying the Worker of Secrets. The Worker becomes angry at this accusation and refers to Alsar as an anomaly. And this is where one of the biggest changes between the Infinity Blade 2 and 3 comes into play. You actually get to play as multiple characters in this game, including Radriar, Cyrus, and Issa. As Radriar, you get to take on the Worker of Secrets in battle, but you very soon are defeated. The Worker explains that he's the planet's ultimate ruler, and that his plan is to destroy all life and start the world anew. Radriar admits that he cannot defeat the Worker, but he says that he knows somebody that can. He sacrifices himself by sending one of the Worker's devices that contains his secrets to Cyrus. Cyrus and Issa now have a new hideout in a beach cove, where they plan out their strategies on how to defeat the Worker. Infinity Blade 3 functions much more like a traditional RPG than the first two games. You would actually go to different locations for each bloodline, and characters you met along the way would join you in the hideout as the central hub. They also added things like a skill tree to the level up system, and multiple Infinity Blades that you could acquire by killing the bosses, that came in many different weapon forms. And also, I would be remiss not to mention the terribly ugly tan turtleneck sweater outfits that Cyrus and Issa wear every time they're not in their armor. The facial animations are a bit rough as well. I mean, you can tell why they had these characters in helmets in the other two games. The majority of the story focused on Cyrus and Issa facing the Deathless that the Worker sent to hunt them down, and Cyrus's inner conflict as he learns of the atrocities he committed when he was Alsar. There's even a section where Cyrus returns to the location of Infinity Blade 1 to confront a shadow version of himself known as Alsar the Vile. He learns that he was once a destructive tyrant, just like those he now stands against. But after killing this part of himself, he's finally able to lay his past to rest. At the end of the game, we learn that the Worker of Secrets' true name is Galath. He's planning to fly his rocket ship into space and to watch all life burn as he starts the world anew. As Cyrus confronts him for the last time, his memories from his life as Alsar begin to return. He's haunted by the times that he and Galath destroyed the lives of billions. This fight is his chance to right all wrongs of his past self. They now stand on even ground, both wielding an Infinity Blade. In the end, Galath disarms Cyrus. He grabs him by the neck in a chokehold and says that he will unmake the world and you. He prepares to stab Cyrus, but Cyrus redirects the blade and stabs it right through the Worker. Galath stumbles to the ground. He tells Cyrus that he made the Infinity Blade, and that it cannot kill him. Cyrus reveals that he never believed that it would kill him. Instead, he inserts the redemption device into the Infinity Blade. This erases all of Galath's memories, and just like Cyrus once was, he will be reborn into a new life as a child. The world has been saved from fire and destruction. Cyrus and Issa continue their relationship together. But most interestingly of all, we see the two of them walking along the beach toward a child building a sandcastle. It's the Worker, Cyrus's greatest enemy, reborn as an innocent child, building the ark where the final battle took place. The fates are now reversed. These were truly genius games. So why were all three of them removed from purchase on the App Store on December 10th, 2018? The official answer is pretty unsatisfying, but let's take a look at it anyways. It says the 3 Infinity Blade games are no longer available for purchase as of today, December 10th, 2018. This groundbreaking trilogy took mobile gaming to new heights and pushed Epic Games in new, innovative directions. Along with the 3 Infinity Blade games, all in-app purchase options have been removed. Current owners will be able to play these games on devices that they were already installed. At Epic, we strive to put players first and to provide a supported, full-fledged experience in every game we publish. With the development of Spyjinx and other projects, it has become increasingly difficult for our team to support the Infinity Blade series at a level that meets our standards. The Infinity Blade series will always hold a special place for me personally and for Epic Games as a whole, Donald Mustard, creative director, said. It's always bittersweet to say goodbye, but we are excited for Spyjinx and what the future holds. If you are wondering, Spyjinx was another mobile game that they were working on at the time. It had a similar stylized art style to Fortnite. There was a beta release for the game, but evidently there wasn't much of a following, and eventually Epic abandoned the idea. There are a few things about this reason that just don't add up. The first one is that the Infinity Blade games were primarily single-player experiences. Sure, they had in-app purchases and events that would be held, but they had no multiplayer servers or anything that would need to be maintained. It mentioned that on devices that had previously bought the games, they would still be available to play, but just without the in-app purchases. Why could they have not left them up on the App Store without these online features? The other thing that makes no sense about this response is that Donald Mustard poured his blood, sweat, and tears into these games for over 8 years. These were his babies. There's no way he would happily hit the delete button after all of the effort he and his team had put into the games. I suspect there is a bit of arm twisting going on here from the corporate overlords of Epic. After doing some research, there's 2 likely answers to why these games were actually removed. The first is that Apple devices and iOS updates come out constantly. Since these games were designed for older versions of iOS and older Apple devices, it sounds like there was some development work that had to be done to get them to run and look as nice as possible with each Apple update. And from what I can tell, by 2018, the sales for these games had mostly run their course. Anybody who was going to play these games or spend money in the game itself mostly already had. Meanwhile, Fortnite was released in 2017, and by 2018, it was a mega hit for Epic. It was their most popular and financially successful game of all time. But because of its free-to-play nature, it needed constant updates for Battle Pass items, new maps, and new modes, in order to stay relevant and keep the money flowing. This is likely why Infinity Blade, Spyjinx, and many of Epic's other projects had their support cancelled, because Epic wanted all of their developers' time and attention solely focused on Fortnite. It's ironic that Donald Mustard's insane success in the creation of Fortnite was also the last nail in the coffin for his beloved Infinity Blade series. Today, there is no legitimate way to purchase these games. Thankfully, they are being kept alive through websites like Internet Archive. I hope that one day Epic will remaster these games. I think they could find a lot of success on the Steam Deck and the Switch, where their original touch-based controls could be utilized. If you guys could subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, that would be an enormous help for me. Unlike big YouTubers that have teams of people to help them, I had to come up with ideas, research, record gameplay, edit, and add voiceover to the video all myself. This is only my second video essay, so I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments on how I did, and what you miss most about the Infinity Blade franchise. Just click on one of my next videos and I'll see you guys there.